Welcome to the Thursday night Flow Feldenkrais class, streaming live out of Jefferson Farm Kitchen. It's Thursday, July 16th, and we're going to do a variation of the Errol Flynn Lesson. For those of you who know what that is, and for those of you who don't, it's let's just say our theme might be side bending, and I've just released the new. It's actually the July 20th version of the newsletter, which you can find at yourlifematters.solutions. I have two Your Life Matters websites. One is for Feldenkrais, and that one ends in .solutions, and the other one is for the 12-step program Out of Grief that ends in yourlifematters.online. Anyway, so if you would, please lie on the floor and just do a beginning scan. And just notice if you have a sense of where your head is in space. And how do you recognize that? One of the reasons we lie on the floor is to use the floor as a way to get a sense of that. So when you scan the back of your head, do you notice that you feel more pressure underneath the base of your skull towards the bottom? Or do you notice that you feel more pressure underneath the top of your head? And then, in the interest of growing in ability to visualize and to perceive and to sense in 3 dimensions, you might scan your chin and notice if your chin is closer to your chest or closer to one shoulder than the other. So you're just sort of taking stock of where you are without judgment and noticing if there's a preference or a residual way that you're relaxing that shows that maybe you have a desk set up at work where you're slightly turned in one direction more than the other, or if you happen to hang out sitting on one hip more than the other when you're driving, which is not uncommon just because of the way driving is asymmetrical. So all these little habits that we do over the course of a day, every day, they affect our posture in these subtle ways because they create an average of movements that we do, and they're different for everybody. Like in old world Europe, where, in Italy and in places where they still, cut grass with a scythe, they do this swinging movement and they're bent over. We don't generally do that movement much here, so that pattern wouldn't be, residual, but in your body. But the pattern of sitting causes the hip flexors to spend. If we sit for 6 hours or 8 hours, the hip flexors are consistently contracted for long periods of time. And so lying on the floor, sometimes there's still a residual pattern of that at the beginning of the lesson, which you don't really notice because it's normal. So that's the other reason why these lessons are valuable, is because we're intentionally putting you in a position where you can try non-habitual actions so that you have a greater awareness of what your patterns are, which, nobody has time to do in their normal life. And when you move quickly, you can't sense these things to the degree that we do here. And the more refined your ability to sense things is, the sooner you can intervene when you notice that you're doing something that might hurt yourself or that is somehow imbalanced, like when you're leaning over too far, or when you're just doing things in your daily life that could lead to injury. And so what we're doing is a process that allows you to work with it in an environment where you can pay attention. And because the nature of learning is that something we know is usually unconscious. Driving is pretty much an unconscious process for most people. You don't have to think about where the accelerator is or where the brake is. But when you want to see if something's working for you, you bring the unconscious process up to the surface where you can deconstruct it and see if it is functional. and then you make some changes, and then you allow it to, as you get better at it, as your coordination improves, it becomes, again, an unconscious process. And so that's kind of how we learn, and why, we have come up with this unusual format, which is a way of dealing with movement that allows you to deconstruct patterns, just to see if they're working for you, to replace non-functional ones with ones that give you greater balance, greater agility, better, less tension, so that when your reflexes fire, something actually happens. So going back to the scan, just notice where your shoulders are. So imagine a line drawn from your left shoulder to your right shoulder, and notice if that line is level. Does one shoulder feel higher, closer to your ear than the other? And all of these noticings are from your perspective. So if you're lying down, then level is from your point of view. And if you're lying down, facing forward is actually looking up at the ceiling. So does one shoulder feel more forward in space, closer to the ceiling than the other? And roll your head a little bit side to side, and just notice what's the quality of the side of your neck. Does one side feel tighter than the other? Does one side feel like it moves more easily than the other? Is your range as far on each side? Or can you only go so far on one side but further on the other? So we've been playing with ways to improve sitting over the last 2 weeks. What I'd like you to do, if you would, is stand up for a minute, and we'll just do a brief sort of movement of reference in standing, and then the rest of the lesson we'll do on the mat. But if you'd stand up slowly, I want to do a movement that is about feeling a connection to your abdominal muscles. So for most of us, when we have anxiety, or when we're stressed, or when things happen that we're not so happy with in the world, we sometimes disconnect from the abdominal muscles, because that's where we feel emotion. And if we want to block out the emotions, or just get the job done if we're working, sometimes we just block that out. So this is kind of a strange movement, but just stand for a moment with your belly relaxed, and notice if you feel like your belly, like if you move your hips forward and back if you move yourself forward and back from the hips, do you do so as a stick, or could you move the pelvis first and then move it backwards by just sort of sticking your butt out slightly? Notice that that's a very different thing. So if you move your butt backwards so it goes over your heels, you might need to bend your knees more so that you can do so without tipping over, and then move your pelvis forward so that it's, how far can you go without feeling like you're going to fall over? So that's one way of moving. And when you're doing that, you're moving your center of gravity, because your center of gravity is about 4 inches or a hand's width underneath your belly button. If you put your hand right below your belly button, just put your hand with your fingers together so that your thumb is in the area of your belly button. Your center of gravity is about where your little finger is in the middle. So in between the front and the back is the center of gravity. So that's what you're doing when you're shifting your weight forward and back this way. You're shifting your center of gravity forward and back. So just relax and stand for a moment. And notice, what do you do when you're standing and you're fairly relaxed? Do you kind of have your belly hanging out? Or chances are, if you're... It depends on who you are and how long you've been on the planet. Like, a lot of teenage girls will stand with their belly contracted, right? Because they're programmed to try to look as skinny as possible. And then at some point, sometimes we just sort of let go of all that programming because it's a lot of work. But from a Feldenkrais point of view, you never want to be in one kind of you never want to get stuck in one position all the time. So this is about learning to be adaptable according to your needs. So if you would, could you raise your arms over your head and imagine you're holding an axe handle and then take the axe handle behind your head, and just at the point when it starts to go forward, as if you were so when your hands are over your head, and so swing your hands backwards and then just over your head, and then stop at the point where you're going forward and feel how you use your belly. So hold that spot for a moment and notice if you feel that there's more of a tension in the belly. Yeah. So just do that a couple times and notice how that feels in front, notice how it feels in back. So that's what it feels like in standing, to have a sort of a taut belly. And notice that it could conceivably even go all the way down to the pelvic floor on some level. And then let that go and lie down. So then if you would, bend your knees and stand your feet, and just try it in this position. So put your hands overhead as if you were holding onto an axe, and your arms are going to, if you're actually, so I can tell if you've ever chopped wood before, your arms probably wouldn't be bent. So really it's only a 2-inch direction, right? So your arms would be straight overhead, and then, you can't really go backwards, but just go forward enough holding this axe until you feel your belly engage. So don't go, it's probably only 6 inches or 7 inches, right? So see how small can you make the movement of taking this axe forward just above your face or your forehead maybe. And can you do so in a way that engages the belly? Notice what happens with the lumbar spine. And then could you do that without the axe and the movement of the arms? So this is actually really, on some level, it's using your whole core, because you notice that you can't just use that part of your stomach. Your whole torso tends to get engaged, and that's actually a good thing. That's we don't want to be segmented into parts. All right, so let that go and just rest it with your arms and legs long for a moment. And take a few deep breaths and notice if you tend to breathe more from your lungs, from your ribs, or do you move more in your belly? So there are these things that we do when we're not really moving well. One of them is that, we hold our breath. So this has a lot to do with diaphragmatic breathing, which is something they do a lot in yoga. And they encourage people to do when you want to relax, you're encouraged to breathe from the belly. Whereas if you're doing something fairly active, like playing tennis or riding a horse, you need to have more stability in the core. So sometimes it's easier to breathe from the chest. So the point is that you need to be able to do what you want when you need to do it. And so this is in the service of learning how to do the same thing in lots of different ways so that you have total normal freedom of motion, because we lose a lot of it as we age and the more sedentary we become. So if you would, put your arms out to the sides so that your arms are on the ground, but you might want to move that bag a little bit so it doesn't distract you. There you go. And bend your feet and bend your knees and stand your feet, sorry. And now bring your attention to your right arm and think of your right arm as the entire length of your right arm is like an axis. And at the very end of this axis on the right arm, which is the right arm, you have your hand. And if you sort of cup your hand just a little bit and then turn your entire arm so that your palm goes a little bit down towards the floor. Notice that your shoulder is attached, so it should go all the way up into your shoulder, and then roll this entire axis backwards so that your thumb comes closer to the ground. And see if you can allow that to travel not just into your upper arm or not just into your forearm and elbow, but all the way up into your upper arm. And then really, at some point, you're initiating the movement maybe from the hand, because that's kind of where I started bringing your attention. But what if you then, the next time you bring your thumb forward and your palm towards the ground, could you initiate the movement from your shoulder so that your entire shoulder comes forward? And could you do it just with the right side? And then when you roll along the axis of your arm, going the other way, can you feel your scapula moving at all underneath you? So just becoming aware of the way that your skeleton is connected and what the huge potential for motion is in the shoulder is actually often a surprise to people. I've always thought this is a great lesson for teaching anatomy, because you can really feel how the bones of the forearm, there are actually two bones in the forearm, and when you roll your hand in this way, your entire arm in this way, in the forearm, those two bones cross. So there's one bone that attaches on the thumb side of your hand to the outside of your elbow. So if your hand, let's say you pause and rest with your hand facing the ceiling in a neutral position, that's when the bones are parallel. So the bone of the forearm that starts on the thumb side, if you just follow straight up to your elbow, that's where that bone is. And then there's another one next to it that's on the opposite side of your wrist that goes from your wrist to the other side of your elbow. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Okay. So then just roll your hand again a little bit and see if you can almost sense those, how when you roll your thumb forward, that bone crosses the other, because it's stabilized at the elbow, but they cross at the wrist. And you could bring your shoulder into it to emphasize it when you go forward. When you go backward, the floor is kind of in your way, so it's harder to feel what's going on behind you. But you may start to sense how your upper arm is attached by ligaments and tendons to the scapula. So it's not actually attached anywhere in a fixed way to your skeleton. So there's a huge range of motion in the shoulder, and we're only playing with a very small part of it. And then when that feels like, okay, that's strange, I've sort of have a sense of that, just let it go and rest. So I think this is called the Errol Flynn Lesson because, well, by some people, not everybody, but because if you think about it, you can imagine, you remember those old movies where they were sparring with rapiers, right? So Errol Flynn was this actor in the I think it was actually before colored movies. It was actually in the black and white era. He started with black and white movies, and he was doing these sort of Three Musketeers type movies where he'd have these sparring. He'd save damsels in distress with his rapier. You don't recognize his name? Yeah, I mean that's going back a ways. So bend your knees and stand your feet if you would. Put your arms out to the sides. And now bring your attention to your left arm and try the same thing with your left arm. So you're just you're rotating the entire axis of the arm. And just notice at first if it feels a little bit unusual, unfamiliar, a little bit vague. Notice if it's sort of smooth in one part of it or bumpy on others. Notice if there's a tendency to sort of brace yourself anywhere. If you feel any sort of parasitic effort in your jaw, your forehead, just notice in the background at the same time so that you start to have a new habit, which is to just scan yourself every once in a while when you're doing something that you need to do, with the intention of eliminating any effort that's not really related to what your intention is. Because, as Moshe Feldenkrais most famously said, if you know what you're doing, you can do what you want. But if you don't know what you're doing, what happens is you end up exerting tons of excessive energy to do even the most basic things, which causes more friction on the joints, wears you out. Just from the point of view of physics, isn't really a functional way to be. So now if you start to do the same movement, but you bring your attention with your arm outstretched so that your palm is facing the ceiling, and start thinking about, okay, so what is that? Visualize that the way that the bones are on the left side. So just visualize in your mind that there's this bone in the forearm from the thumb to the elbow, and then on the other side of the wrist, from that side of the wrist up to the elbow, and then go back into doing this movement where you're rotating along the axis of the entire thing, and see if you can sort of visualize how the bones cross when you bring the hand and thumb forward or around itself towards the floor. And then if you really want to let that sort of translate through your upper arm into your shoulder, that does give you slightly more range. And going backwards is perhaps there's not as much room there, partly because the floor is in the way. But it's also a stabilizing factor, right? It prevents it from just being a free-for-all because you have something, it's like it gives you a frame of reference. And it's really helpful to have a frame of reference as a human being. That may be one of the reasons why gravity is important, among other things. So there are these laws that we're subject to all the time that we don't even have to learn. It's like you don't jump around as a child expecting to fly up into the air unless that's something you're really interested in. Like we get to observe that balls fall down when we drop them, and as do glass. But that's probably more from the reaction of our parents if we happen to drop a glass, right? So there are these things that we learn on our own, and then there are these things that we learn by proxy via the response of our parents. And yeah, feel free to rest at any time. So paying attention requires rest. We don't think of paying attention as something that uses up calories. I don't know about calories, but it does use up calories. I mean, it uses up a lot of oxygen. And if you remember being in college where you had to study for days and days and, do something for a test, you did get hungry. We sort of dismiss paying attention as something that is actively doing something. No wonder our kids aren't really very interested in paying attention. We don't really seem to value it as a skill, unless you hang out with people in mindfulness circles or people who meditate. So here's a little trick. If you would, could you bend your knees and stand your feet and put your arms out to the side? And now, if you want to do two opposite things, it helps if you get one thing going. It's a little bit like juggling. So bring your attention back to your left arm and allow yourself to rotate along the entire axis of your arm so that your hand goes down. Well, let's make this a little bit easier. How about you do the same thing on both sides? So the next time you roll your arm, roll both arms in the same direction and just see if you can engage the shoulders and see if you can feel just a wee bit more pressure underneath the scapula when you roll the other way. When you really develop the range here, you'll find that your scapula, your shoulder blades actually slide down towards your pelvis when you roll your thumbs up towards the ground. And then how could you let this travel through the rest of you? Does it affect your chin? And can you be soft in your neck? Just be sure that you're not pressing your head into the floor without noticing that you are. Some of us have this habit of using the head in a way that is not really meant to be used. So all of these little details will make the difference between being sore afterwards, even from doing tiny little movements, versus actually having a greater sense of freedom of mobility and a greater sense of, I walked away, I think, from my first lesson feeling like, wow, I have more space in my body. So pause for a moment and see if you could alternate first one, then the other. So one arm rotates in one direction, and then the other arm rotates in the other. Or is it easier to do both at the same time in opposite directions? Whichever you spontaneously do is probably going to be the thing that's easiest for you to do, as well as easiest for you to wrap your brain around conceptually. But when you get good at sort of conceptualizing things that are being told to you, movements, for example, that you're being directed to do without actually having any demonstration of them, it improves your ability to learn how to understand conceptual ideas, in a classroom. It improves your ability to think problems through and to visualize potential solutions. And because we try all these strange variations, you start to get into a rhythm of thinking, okay, what might the next variation be? What's a logical next step? And that's something that they use in goal-setting circles. It's like, you don't need to know the full picture. You don't need to know what you're going to do for the next 30 years. If you have a goal that's important to you, you really just need to know the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step. And that occurs when you are present. All right, so now exaggerate it a little bit so that let's say you're initiating the movement from the shoulder so that one arm goes down or rotates down while the other one rotates up. And notice, what could you do with your eyes? Which side would be easier to look at? Would it be easier to look at the hand rolling up or the hand rolling down? And go ahead and open your eyes and turn your head to look at one hand and then the other, and just notice which seems congruent. It seems easier. And it may have something to do with which shoulder is coming forward. So rather than multitasking, which is what most people do, can you expand your awareness to include more of yourself in one single picture. So you're expanding the image of yourself that you have at one time in different dimensions, forward, backwards, sideways. And yeah, just notice if there's a tendency to have it, is it easier to let it move all the way down through your body so that your hips become involved? Like maybe there's one side that becomes shorter while your other side becomes longer. What could you do to make it super easy for yourself? And notice if you if you find that it's interesting to allow your knees to roll to one side and your pelvis to come up on one side, if that helps. Are you actually pushing through the floor with your feet? Are you using ground forces to stabilize yourself? So in physics, they say that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So by that definition, I'm thinking ground forces might actually be the force that pushes back at you when you push through the floor. Because I've not actually heard anybody give me a real definition of what ground forces are. I have to go ask a physicist. Unfortunately, Feldenkrais isn't talking. So just play with that until you feel like you have a sense of it. You could imagine doing it without doing it, and then take a rest. So human beings, I'll just talk while you're resting about child development and how we learn, and why this is a form of organic learning that improves your ability to learn in general, and then it carries off the mat into cognitive learning as well as problem solving and invention and creation. So one of the things that makes this clear is when we look at how humans are different from animals. So the two things that make us so different in terms of our apprenticeship in being alive is that we take a long time to learn how to speak. We take a long time to learn how to walk. And that's even not enough. I mean, if you left a human being at 2 years old able to walk and speak, that wouldn't be enough for them to survive, right? It takes many, many more years for us to learn all the things we need to learn in order to be able to survive on our own. So some of the things that we need to learn, so let's just bring it back to learning what we need to do just to live in a body. I don't know about you, but I remember being small and thinking, this is I don't know, I remember feeling like there were certain aspects of having a body that I thought were sort of distasteful. So there's one of the things that Moshe Feldenkrais wrote about in the book, The Potent Self, was how some of the things we learn on our own, and we kind of have to learn on our own. And then there are other things that we learn that are adults in the immediate environment, they get very excited about, or they get very involved in. And those things sometimes become highly charged emotionally. So, like I'm sure we've all known people who had trouble potty training their kids while other people have no problem at all. And like my mother, for example, I think she was very obsessed with dieting and weight, right? So somehow food is a big deal in my mind. Food is like how she expressed love. So, and that's pretty common, I think, in Jewish families and Italian families and in families where, cooking is a deal. So the point is that some of the things that we have to learn on our own and we just learn without interference, often we can figure them out and learn them organically, and it's not really a big deal. So what we're looking for, some of the things that we're maybe a little bit dysfunctional about, like I tend to eat more than I need to because I have this very happy association with, sharing food with people. And and so that's an example of something that it's not entirely balanced, let's say. So the things that we might have learned from parents who were either really eager that we learned how to do, like if you have, there was a study once where they, I think in Poland or somewhere, where they had these children who lived in an orphanage, and so they did an experiment where some of the children that lived in the orphanage, when they were learning how to walk, the staff made a huge fuss and said, "Oh, that's just wonderful, and look at you walking up and down stairs," and they just made a big deal of it. And then half of the children, they just completely didn't really make a deal of it. And you would expect that the children who were made much of actually got better and were more progressive in their learning. But it turns out that the students the orphans that were left alone when they were learning how to walk and climb stairs were actually better at it because they didn't get distracted. And so another way that this manifests, I think, is in a tendency to some people call it the disease to please, when the desire to be a people pleaser is so dramatic that you're just outside your own body and putting everyone else's needs in front of your own. It's possible that occurs out of that kind of situation where somebody's intervened in your learning and created a big fuss, so that you start to become extrinsically motivated by what other people want and think. So when you're ready, just touch base with what we just did. So bend your knees and stand your feet, put your arms out to the side, and just go again and see if you can find a rhythm with rolling one arm down along its axis while the other arm rolls up, and see if you can find a rhythm with, like, if you do the whole movement with your face facing the ceiling, and you're really rigid in your neck and your shoulder while you're rolling one arm up and the other arm down, notice if that's very different than if you allow yourself to look at one hand and then the other. Does it feel easier if you allow it to move throughout your entire self?
It's like rocking.
It's like rocking, yeah. So, it might be interesting over the course of the next 24 hours or so to think about, what are the areas where I was left alone to figure out how to organize myself. Like, or, what are the areas where, like if there's a charge around numbers or money. Maybe it's because people stood over your shoulder and watched you while you were trying to figure out how to learn how to count. I mean, who knows? So the point is that this is a way of sort of noticing where things are easy and where there's an emotional charge, because that emotional charge often interferes with our ability to do things easily. Like, I have a friend who's really good at teaching, at presenting, but she's convinced that she can't figure the technology out. She's got this emotional charge around the technology, which I think actually for her is not related to parents. I think it's related to the fact that she's got an old computer and she didn't have enough money to go out and buy a new one. So she just gets really annoyed at the computer really easily, and that is like a dysfunctional response, right? It just gets in the way because she wants to do things on Zoom and, learn how to. Yeah. Yeah. Well, depending, I don't know. So stop for a moment, and then now the next variation of this is actually if you would come up on one knee. So actually come up into 3D and come up and be on your knees. And then have just one knee forward and the other knee is on the mat. So in other words, you're on one knee, as if you were proposing to someone, And then put your arms out and see if you can do the same movement where you're rotating along the axis of your arm. And one side's going down and the other side's going up. And notice what your initial tendency is.
Is there a dance like this?
There probably is, yeah. So I think, so it's really interesting. Is that hard on your knee?
No, it's a cramp.
Okay, so I'm just going to get a pad so that your knee isn't on the mat's on the hard floor. Yeah, if you were on this, I don't know if this will help.
Oh, that should be okay.
Yeah, just in case you need it. So notice that this is harder balance-wise because you have a smaller base of support, right?
Yeah.
And notice if you try to hold your body really stiff while you move your arms, it actually makes it harder. And if you allow the whole movement to sort of spiral through you and pick a side to look so that you use your eyes with what you're doing, does that make it easier? And notice if you've chosen to, spontaneously without realizing it, have you chosen to roll your hands in the same direction along the length of your arm, or have you remembered to have one going in one direction? I mean, both are valid options. The question is, are you aware of what you're doing so that you can do what you want? So it's interesting how these different movements sometimes evoke images or memories, or just, maybe having gone to a folk dancing class where you felt awkward or something. All right, so go ahead and rest and notice. So let's say you started where you were on your left knee with your right foot standing, just so I remember. And what could this possibly have to do with the whole abdominal thing? It's actually not directly related, but I chose it as a reference of movement because if it gets added in, when you go back to sitting at a desk when you go to work, there's this ability, having this ability to move in your waist and in your pelvis in all these different directions is actually a way that you can give yourself a break. Yeah, so for example, if you start thinking in terms of the face of a compass or a clock, like right now, if your knees are bent and your feet are up and you kind of have your knees over your pelvis, can you imagine that your sacrum was on the face of a clock and just put your knees together.
Sacrum?
Your sacrum is the bone on the back of your pelvis that's on the floor. That's it, yeah. And then just very slowly, can you make a circle on the floor with your pelvis so it's going as if going around your sacrum? So you could do that in sitting, right, if you can imagine it, but you wouldn't be doing it on your sacrum, you'd be doing it on your sit bones. But it's another way that you can kind of give yourself, notice how it stretches the sides of your waist, right? So it's another way to give yourself a bit of a break without actually having to go walk somewhere, because sometimes you're not really at liberty to do that. And then just let that go and rest for a moment. So sacrum, I forget if it's Greek or Latin, but it means, it's like a keystone. It's like a sacred keystone in the arch. So if you know anything about architecture, They didn't know how to build two-story buildings until they learned how to build a Norman arch, which is basically a doorway where there are these branches that come together at the very top. And that's exactly how a human being is shaped. If you think of your legs as the sides of the door, and then a Norman arch classically has these sort of, they're like, it's an arch shape that comes to a point at the top. And then sometimes there's actually a keystone that's shaped like right. And so what happens is that the weight of the second story pushes the arch onto the keystone, so it stabilizes the entire structure. That's what your sacrum, that's what the weight of your upper body does when it's over your sacrum. It stabilizes your legs on the ground. So when you're ready, could you come back up and onto your other knee and try doing it on the other side? So, yeah, I think yes. So you're on your right knee, your left foot's standing, your arms are out to the outside. And now decide first whether you're going to move both arms. Try moving both arms at the same time. And notice if you're inhibiting anything in your ribs, right? So do both arms in the same direction. Oh.
It's okay. If I see this one.
Yeah.
Did you see it?
I did.
Should I be more steady? I feel so unsteady. It's like
So it's a challenge. This is harder in space because you're not used to having. We're used to stabilizing yourself with two knees or 2 feet, but not one knee and 1 foot. So this is challenging. So intend to turn your arms in the same direction and use your shoulders more. That's it. So when you don't have the floor behind you, is it easier to feel your shoulder blades? Imagine when you rotate your hands so that your thumbs go up towards the ceiling and behind you, can you imagine your shoulder blades coming down and towards your spine? And so that's the thoracic spine up there, where most people are pretty much have not a lot of clarity about any of what's going on back there. So now would it make more sense for you to look down a little bit and look up towards the ceiling at some point? Would that facilitate it if both arms are going in the same direction? So wait, stick with the both arms going in the same direction and think, does it help to sort of flex the upper thorax and extend? And does it help when you use your eyes? Does it help when you lead with your eyes? Is it easier to be rhythmic? And then maybe just rest on your knees for a moment, if that would work. Or what?
or on the bottom.
Any which way you'd like. Or even a child's pose. That's another kind of a nice way to rest. Notice how that stretches. That's what that's called, what you were just doing. So when your knees are bent and you're sort of crouched and your hands and elbows are on the floor and the top of your head's on the floor, that's a child's pose in yoga. All right, so just touch base with it one more time. So come into the same position, right foot, or right knee, left foot, sorry, and then put your arms out to the side, and this time very deliberately think, okay, now I'm going to roll one arm up while the other rolls down, and see how could you make it easier by allowing, just remembering to let it move through you by looking in one direction. So notice, is it easier? Does it spontaneously seem easier to look in the direction of the hand that's rolling towards the ceiling? Or the other way around? And you decide, so that you start to really rely on subjective experience and then let it go if you're tired or if you're losing balance. So that's really what this is about on some level, this whole discussion of, like, are we motivated to learn and to perform and to succeed because somebody patted us on the head and gave us a lot of attention? That's a problem, because as adults, we don't usually get that. So it's another reason why all learning stops at some point. If we're just used to being extrinsically motivated, like for people who have this disease to please, often they'll say, well, I don't actually really keep my promises to myself. If somebody calls me up or makes an appointment or is standing right in front of me, I'm like there in 2 minutes. I'm off doing whatever it is they're asking me to do, or I'm attempting to, make them comfortable or do whatever it is they need, or, that's a problem. Because ultimately it just leads to burnout. If you want to be there for people, you have to be able to be there for yourself first and keep your word to yourself. Otherwise you just, like, self-esteem isn't something that we get because people gave us a lot of ribbons because they were handing out ribbons to everybody in the contest. That's not what builds self-esteem, right? That was a little bit of a false notion, I think, in the 70s that they had about child rearing. But what builds self-esteem is really when you keep your word to yourself and you do so repeatedly, and then over time you say, hey, I was there for myself, and then when you're there for yourself, you can be there for other people in a way that you couldn't be when you let yourself get completely overextended. So this is a really good, awareness through movement is a really good practice for caregivers, for like nurses and people who are doing hospice work or taking care of elderly parents, because it's so easy to get just completely strung out and all involved in what everybody else needs when you're, a caregiver. Because you have no time to yourself and you have no time to sort of really connect with your own needs. So coming to this, something like this, where you spend an hour every week just thinking about, well, how do I feel? What is more comfortable? I mean, it seems super basic, and it is, but it needs to be basic because you're creating a new habit. And just take a few breaths and just notice how good it feels to lie down and be still. And now in this position, touch base once more with the original variation with the knees bent and the arms out to the side, so that you're first do both arms rotating along the axis in the same direction, and just notice, is there some way that you can involve your chin and your neck? And then once you've tried one variation, at least 3 or 4 times, go to the other variation. So when you start to remember these movements without being told, when we do them a couple of times, then you're increasing your ability to sort of remember sequential processes through a feeling, through muscle memory rather than, or through visualizing, so that not everything is in words. Ironically, this is taught via language, but what it ends up doing, the result is that it helps us become more proficient in imagining and creating and thinking in images or sensations, so that we're using more of our senses, involving more of ourselves, which itself is generative, like creativity. The more you do it, the more ideas you get, the more insights you get, the more inspiration you get, the more you get curious about, well, what if I did this? And then let that go and rest for a moment and just think about how kids learn, babies. How do they learn how to use their arms? What are rattles and keys for? Why are people always dangling keys in front of babies? Because they see the key and it's shiny and they think, oh, what's that? And they want to explore it with their mouth, right? So but the way they get that key so they can bring it to their mouth, which most parents probably don't want, is they then learn how to use their scapula and their arm to reach and turn and rotate and grasp in the same way you were doing in this lesson. And notice that, if you think it through, if you imagine that how it felt when you were doing it on one knee, when you really reach forward for something, can you sort of imagine the feeling of how that sort of circular rotation does make it easier to reach for something? So go back to the reference movement. So bend the knees and stand the feet, and then have your hands overhead. Your arms are fairly straight overhead, as if you're holding an axe. Rest your arms on the floor and imagine holding an axe. And then just bring your arms forward just enough that you feel your abdomen engage, and then allow your arms to rest on the floor. And do that a few times. And just notice, do you push your belly out when you... Does your belly spontaneously get pushed out when you do this?
In.
Okay.
A little sit-up.
It's a little sit-up. Yeah. All right, so then rest, and let's just do a last scan. So bring your legs long, and bring your attention to the pressure you feel under the back of your head, and notice if it's the same as when you began or different. And notice when you're resting, if your neck hurts, that would indicate that you might have been holding it too stiff more than letting it move. Or it might indicate that you were pressing it into the floor at times without being aware of that. So, Feldenkrais was coming at this from different experiences, but one as an engineer, when you have a machine, if there's friction anywhere, that creates wear and tear. So, but machines don't have, some cars now have these funny sensors where they can help you park, but for the most part, they can't compare to the human body, because you have all these sensors in your arms and in your extremities and your feet and your hands that help you know if you have resistance. And so resistance is felt as tension. So when you learn to sort of override tension that you weren't aware you had with your conscious awareness, at least while you're here, it becomes slowly a new habit. And then that frees up energy for more fun things, but it also creates less tension, less friction in your joints, so your joints don't wear out prematurely. Because theoretically, you should be able to last a long time. Apparently, there are people in these blue zones in Sardinia for some reason. This island off of the south of Italy is a huge blue zone where there are just tons of people who live over 100 years. Over 100 years. So the ideas we have about life expectancy are not necessarily fixed. And I don't know that living a long time is so desirable, but Feldenkrais enables you to have better quality of life now and in the future. So I'm more interested in quality of life than length. But if we're going to be alive, let's feel good. Let's enjoy it. So notice that sometimes it's actually really nice to not be thinking in thoughts, that sometimes it's nice to be thinking in images. It's restful. It fires a different part of the brain, the cortex. it's interesting to notice that people who do think in images more, say artists, often are predominantly, like you'll notice that the left side of their face ends up being more contracted than the right. And people who are analytical thinkers, often the right side of their face tends to be more contracted. So, we have a dominant preference in the way that we think that affects the musculature of our face. That's all evidence of sort of unconscious contractions when we're doing things. So take another deep breath or two and just notice if you feel a little bit more freedom to breathe upwards and forwards and sideways when you inhale, not just, has it expanded your ability to breathe in all directions in any way, shape, or form? So there are these little side fringe benefits to doing these strange non-habitual lessons. And then just scan the things that we scanned in the beginning. So what was the line from the left shoulder to the right? Notice if it's level. Notice if one shoulder is more forward than the other, one's higher than the other, or has any of that has there been a new set point? Like the system rebooted. And then just the sense of the chin being more centered or more close to one side than the other. And is there more of a sense of openness in the front of the pelvis that, it wasn't distinguishable when you first lay down, perhaps, that there was excessive contraction in the flexors in front of the hips. But now that it's maybe less of a deal, maybe that you have less contraction in the front of your hips, do your hips actually feel more open? So it's this interesting, weird paradox that we only notice discomfort in some cases when it's gone. What's up with that? And that's how we get trapped in these parasitic habits of excessive tension, because they become the new normal and we don't even notice they're there until we're released. It's like getting out of jail. Not used to all that space and light and freedom. And can you feel the weight of your jaw? Can you sort of have your mouth closed and your lips closed, but it's not like there's tension there. That's just sort of the resting position of how you hold your mouth when you're not talking. And then very slowly come to standing and just notice, to bring your attention to your abdomen as you come to stand. Just notice, do you use it? Do you not use it? I'm not saying you should or shouldn't. There's no right or wrong. It's just, I'm interested right now, for some reason this week, I'm interested in just not tuning out the abdomen and the pelvic core, the pelvic floor, because they carry the weight. They really stabilize the back, and they carry the weight of all those organs. And as you walk around a little bit, can you feel any, just walk around and see if there's any residual sensations from the lesson. Like, is there any aspect of walking that allows you to really feel this way that you were rotating to look from one side to the other? And when you walk, do you look to the side of the hip that's coming forward, or do you look to the side of the hip that's being left behind? And if you think in 3D, if you can imagine the length of your spine while you do so, you're actually rotating around your spine, the axis of your spine. So maybe next time you go to a coffee shop or sit somewhere and have lunch and you watch people walk by, you can notice if people are walking and not moving their arms at all. Or notice if if there's any rotation in their pelvis, or if they're actually, when you have your weight on the forward leg, it's easier to shorten that side so that you could actually put all your weight on that leg. And if your pelvis is free for motion, when you walk, you'll notice that there is a little bit of extension when you walk, such that you can more easily leave the leg on the ground behind you when your hip flexors are not perpetually contracted without awareness. Anyway, so that's it. That's the lesson, and hope to see you all next time. Go to yourlifematters.solutions, and there are some replays of these on YouTube, so you can just go to YouTube and do a search for Flow Feldenkrais. All right, see you next time. At this point, in July, we're doing Thursdays, 5:30 Pacific Standard Time. All right, bye.